All right, so I was just ending on the discussion on the declining Portuguese Empire, um, and I'll move on now to the Russian. Not a big part to talk about, as you saw in the textbook. Um, but again, I'm wanting you to get a feel or an understanding about these different aspects that we see coming out of European nations fighting for control of other nations. And something I wanted to mention that I forgot to state that I also want to incorporate, and I hope you're always seeing that, while I sometimes seem like I'm going a little off topic or a little bit of bouncing around, I want what we're learning to fit into a context now that we can see why this applies or why we would care about it now. You know, Basically what we're seeing happen here up until World War One, and to a certain extent in World War Two, but the Treaty of Versailles that was so controversial usually is talk when they talk about what that's going to mean for Germany and the rise of Hitler. The other aspect of that is that while the United States was talking about and promising all these other nations the right to self-determination, as soon as World War One was over, there was a big debate over which former colonies get to go to which imperial powers still. Um, and We're going to see this later on in discussing even, the Middle East. Um, the Turks are going to get kicked out, and the French and the British are going to take over, and they're going to leave their legacy there as well. All kind of really stemming from back to this time period of these roles that Europeans, the West, is playing in non-Western parts of the world. Okay, and so anyhow, with Russia, there the nation of Russia is quite large. I think any of us, if you look at a map, Americans don't look at maps that often. I'm afraid that's the reputation, anyways, and I think it's true. But take a look at a map. Russia is humongous and has a lot of diverse peoples. And so, in a certain sense, Russia itself is its own landmass empire, in the same way that China is somewhat. But I don't want to go too far off on that topic as well. But having said that, while Russia did not go beyond heavily the landmass of its bordering territories, it's always played a role in dominating, being an empire to people around it, such as Poland and the Crimean region. Um, Alaska actually is quite close to Russia, right? And we bought it off them for very cheap. Many politicians in America at the time were they called Seaward's icebox. I thought, why would you want to buy that for? Well, talk about an accidental strategic blessing in terms of Cold War thinking, and other factors like oil and fishing and all sorts of things that resource-wise are going to be important to certain industries in the United States. In any case, Russia did actually, as you saw in this chapter, make its way into California, and it put it at odds with Spain. And here we see, strangely, in the Western Hemisphere of what is now United States, these superpowers of Russia and Spain and Britain having different kind of interests over here. And so we see what the Russian American Company was established in 1789. I'm sure a lot of you have not heard of that. It built trading posts along the Pacific seaboard from Alaska down to Fort Ross in Northern California, right? And essentially, though, we know that their presence is going to be to the point where it's actually not even realized. But the fact that they are so close to Alaska, I mean, if you remember in the presidential elections a few years ago when Sarah Palin um, was McCain's vice president candidate, and she was asked about what basically her political views on Russia. She said, I know all about Russia. I can see it from my house. You remember? She got kind of made fun of for that because she wasn't really demonstrating in the interview a strong knowledge of geopolitics on the subject. I'm not saying she doesn't know any of those things. I'm just saying that she wasn't like, that's what people were kind of like poking at her you know, people who didn't agree with her politics. But my point is that I wanted to bring it up for is that yes, Sarah Palin could see Russia from her house. Okay, and so that explains, sometimes I just think, again, as Americans, we don't really think about geography and the implications of it. But for the most part, that's all we have to really say about Russia and their legacy of colonialism. Outside of, again, Eastern Europe and their own border areas. Okay, so then we have a discussion of mercantile warfare and protectionism. I think for the most part, what I want you to realize about this, instead of going into detail about all these other wars, okay, that what I want you to realize is that that World War I really wasn't the first World War. You could sometimes argue that the 7 Years' War was the first World War, and possibly accidentally triggered off by none other than our hero George Washington. In the middle of the tensions that was taking place between French and British interests here in North America, he basically by accident had some French diplomats killed. It was a political mistake. I mean, we can talk about moral mistakes, but it had repercussions that were going to help ignite a set of tensions that were already there. I think what's kind of interesting, you notice the 7 Years' War is ends in 1764. Think about the Declaration of Independence. Okay, here starting in 1775, and then really think about 1776 of being written, but the Declaration of Independence. But they're very close to each other. You know, I have a friend that is British, and he told me the British perspective on the War of Independence. And what he basically said, how they look at this, is to say that the British wanted the American frontiers to stay where they were at. And they didn't want the colonists to keep pushing into French territory to ignite tensions there, which it was doing. But there was no way for the British to control that, really. And so you kept having colonists on the frontier, British colonists, pushing to get land for themselves to go out into the wild, wild west, right? And they were taking on Native Americans and they were taking on the French, and it was creating tensions with the French, and inevitably it's going to be a part of this bigger picture here in which the British are going to fight with the French, and it's going to cost a lot of money. And for the British, the fact that the colonists kept instigating a lot of things in their mind, and the fact that the British were able to use their resources to help clear out the quote-unquote French threat and secure this land for British colonists, it would make sense that taxing the colonists and finding a way to get more money to make the colonies more economically viable in the interests of the British Empire, which is what it was set up for in the first place, seemed to make sense. For the British government, the colonists were ungrateful, spoiled children who didn't appreciate that they just got themselves in a better position against the French because of the British Empire, and that they just were acting like ridiculous to go off and say, oh, we don't have a right to be controlled or have taxes now, even though we got this aid from you this whole time, and it costs a lot of money and casualties on your part. So this is kind of the narrative. This is the counter narrative to the way that the British look at the American War for Independence. Okay, and I just thought that's an interesting perspective to maybe put into it, just to kind of like see. Ultimately, it definitely did have those results, whether or not the colonists should have been appreciative or not is another topic, and whether or not the British were able to actually affect. I mean, that's a whole other topic altogether. But again, I just wanted you to see there is a different way of looking at that, and that ultimately things could have turned out different. This could be the United States of America, but said in French, right? Okay. Ultimately, we're going to see the American War for Independence, and we're going to see the French Revolution, which we're going to talk about in a whole nother chapter. Okay, but I'm going to end right here. What I'd like to show you is I'm going to put on a clip on the 7 Years' War, okay, and then I'll move on to the next discussion, okay, about the Atlantic world.